That's the first time I've had a belt snap clean off. Wacky. I think I just hate belt drives at this point. I mean, I realized that I wasn't using my electric skateboard for the exact purpose that it was designed for. Street board is definitely not designed to do gravel rail trails. The amount of frustration I've had having to constantly clean out the pulley and belts for the drivetrain it just makes trying to do backpacking trips on it have more problems than it's worth. For this particular trip, I wasn't trying to do anything crazy. It was about 200 kilometers from where I was starting in Waterloo to where I was supposed to finish in Pickering, which would have linked right up at the start of the e-bike bikepacking trip on the Super 73 as part of my ongoing attempt to cover the entire west to east coast of the Trans-Canada Trail. But yeah, on the second day of this trip, man, the number of times I had to pull apart that drivetrain and try and figure out what the heck was going on was absurd. And towards the end of it, I don't even know what was happening. Just the belt was refusing to grip onto the wheel pulley. There was no gravel or anything lodged in there. The spring was properly tensioning the motor drive gear, so I don't know why it just couldn't grip. Maybe the belts were being stretched out too much. As best I could figure, sand and gravel was getting in there and just wearing it down in just enough to the point where it wasn't able to catch anymore. And because of that, I think I'm pretty much done with belt drives for any sort of trips that involve any amount of dust or gravel like that. And unfortunately, the Trans-Canada Trail has a lot of dirt and gravel trail sections. So I know people in my comments have mentioned it before. I think it's finally time to start seriously working on an all-terrain build. I'm now considering a gear drive setup. In particular, I'm looking at the Meepo Hurricane Ultra. It's direct gear on gear. Instead of having a belt, it's direct. Like, there's no belt in between. It's just gear on gear action. And most importantly, it's enclosed for the most part. So it's really hard for dust and grit to get in there. I'm also considering maybe a direct drive option, but the only one that I'm super familiar with is the TorqueBoard's direct drive motors, and those apparently have problems, especially with an all-terrain build with a larger wheel size. But the Meepo Hurricane Ultra seems to offer me everything that I'm looking for in a board for touring and backpacking trips. It's got a reasonably long deck. It's 44 inches, so that gives me a lot of space to spread out my feet and get a really stable stance with a heavy backpack on. It's got a nice size battery. I think it's like 690 watt hours. It's got a relatively easily hot swappable battery because it's got a carbon fiber deck, the version that I'm looking at. It actually is a top loader. Now, it is still held in place with screws and quite a lot of them, but I figure I can either devise some sort of system to make that top hatch quick removable or only use like 4 bolts to keep it in place. But I'm still on the fence. I'm curious what you guys think. Do you think the Meepo Hurricane Ultra will be a good touring board? Do you have any particular builds and setups in mind that I should look into? Let me know. I haven't completely written off a hub drive build for an all-terrain board either. Something like a Backfire Ranger X3, where it's got 4 hub motors and I believe airless tires. So for a touring board, I don't need something super torquey with like a super high top speed. I'm just looking for something that can get me and my backpacking gear just under 300 pounds total combined weight at a nice decent cruising speed of 20-25 kilometers an hour for, you know, steady flat ground at a reasonable speed. So I think hub motors would still be perfectly fine for that. But aside from the drivetrain issues, other than that, on this trip, the board actually performed surprisingly well in other areas. Like, after I waited out the rain for 5 hours, even though my board only takes 3 hours to charge up all the batteries, I decided to say screw it and try and ride anyways. The rain had died down, but everything was still absolutely drenched. And I didn't realize it when I had left my charging spot, but the rail trail that I was supposed to be riding on was absolutely soaked. I'm talking like ruts filled with water, and like all the grass and dead leaves and everything all just completely saturated with water. So at worst, I had thought I was only going to get some splashback from the pavement and maybe some wet gravel flying up. No, things got really wacky, man. I was riding through water, like deep puddles where the water was coming up to the top of the deck deep. I am absolutely surprised that I did not fry my board. I'm surprised I didn't get any water intrusion into the ESC. I'm surprised I didn't get any 0 nilch water intrusion at all into the battery case on the top of the deck. That case is not designed to be watertight at all. And no, even after hours of riding in like the nastiest, super foggy, super drenched, water everywhere type of environment, it was still bone dry inside of that battery case. That's probably the most surprising thing that came out of that trip. And to this day, The board's still working fine from an electronic standpoint. I just gotta wait till the drivetrain replacement parts come in and then it'll pretty much be good as new. Aside from the board itself, on this particular trip, the time of year and the weather weren't doing me any favors. I'm really starting to find that the shoulder seasons, like late fall, early spring, are super rainy. A lot of inclement weather. I got rained out for 5 hours and it was still kind of sprinkling a little bit when I actually left and tried to make some distance. Also, because it's super late in the year, you don't get very many daylight hours right now either. So that really cuts down on the amount of daylight that I have to get from point A to point B. What I did on this trip during the second leg, where I was riding in the dark, that was really, really risky. Now, I knew it and I was being very careful and paying extra close attention to where I was going. But yeah, it was super dark, wet, drenched, and it was foggy, like super foggy. And I was in a really rural area where not only was there no light whatsoever, but there wasn't even any cell reception on that particular stretch of trail. Thankfully, I made it through that without any issues, and I got to the hotel and had somewhere warm and dry to stay for the night. But that could have turned out really badly. I did know that that was a possibility, so I was prepared that my board could just break down and stop working, in which case I would have to tow it up to the road and keep walking until I got cell reception and then figure out what I was doing. So another thing I wanted to address was I haven't been ignorant to the fact that a lot of my trips lately I've been spending nights in hotels and motels rather than out camping, especially on the skateboard trips. This particular time of year, there's no campgrounds that are open, and stealth camping is harder because there's no leaf coverage, so it's super easy to see stealth camps. That's aided by the fact that it gets dark super early, so I do have the cover of darkness to help me stay hidden. I had been considering stealth camping along that particular stretch of gravel trail where it was super wet if I wasn't able to get to the hotel. I was so completely soaked on my legs and my socks. My feet were absolutely waterlogged. So I knew there was a hotel within a reasonable distance, and I decided that I could get there, get all my stuff dry, let the board dry, which was the important part. I wanted the board to, not let water soak into it. So if it hadn't have been for me being completely drenched, I would have been more open to just setting up shop there, because there was a lot of opportunities and places to camp along there, and it was already dark. I could have been up and gone before light set in the next day. I'm giving myself a pass for this particular past trip, but going forward, my name is Mike in the Woods. I would like to be more in the camping side of things on these touring and backpacking trips. On the morning section of day 2 on this trip, I was definitely starting to get chilled, especially because I still had wet shoes and socks from the night before. They hadn't completely dried. So the curse continues to plague me where I can't make it more than one night out on an adventure before something goes wrong where I finish the trip. I've definitely nailed it down to the drive system being a problem. I think once I replace it with a more enclosed drivetrain setup, I think I'll eliminate a lot of the source of problems. I'm finally relenting to those of you who have been suggesting I just get an AT board. Yeah, I think it's time. I think you guys are right. But I'm not giving up. I'm gonna keep filling in sections of the Trans-Canada Trail, some on my electric skateboard, some on my electric bike, and as these projects come into fruition, I'll also be covering sections like the water sections on my autonomous inflatable boat project. Once it comes together, I'll also be using my electric snowboard, which is actually starting to come together. I had a setback where I twisted off the motor wires, but other than that, the whole thing's fully assembled. I just need a replacement motor. I'll do an update video on that very soon with how much progress I've made since the last one. It's starting to look really nice. There's some remote sections in like the Yukon where an electric rideable of some kind isn't really feasible. On those road sections, I might even use my Tesla Model 3, which is scheduled to be delivered next week as of the recording of this video. And there's some other electric rideable projects that I have in the works that are really bizarre that I think you guys will enjoy, that I'll do sections of the TCT on. I'm not going to spoil it, but let's just say things are going to get screwy. And if you're interested in watching all the coverage I have of the Trans-Canada Trail, I've actually put together a playlist of all the trip videos I've done covering it, and I'm organizing the playlist in a way that it's covered from west to east, so some will have been filmed earlier or later than others. The whole idea is to have it as a complete through ride from west to east over the course of all of the trips that I do over many years. I'll see you guys next time.